All right, hey everyone. Welcome to another Gateway API call. I know we've had a lot of these recently, so thanks to everyone for showing up to another one. I think let's start off with Jeff. Maybe we can revisit some of the gap discussion here for route delegation.
Sure.
Cool. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of discussion here. I don't know. Do you have a summary of, or maybe I can summarize? I don't know.
Yeah, I've been a little behind this week, so I haven't been able to follow all the comments. But I know you've been following it a little bit closer. So if you want to summarize, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So last week we got a lot of feedback. I think we had more feedback on this gap than any other gap, and more discussion last week than I think any of us expected. So it was a good refresher on just all the different perspectives here. I took some time over the past week to reach out to people that had voiced concerns or hesitation around this gap, to try and understand those in a little bit more detail. I added a comment at the bottom that seemed to summarize concerns and suggestions and whatever. But there's a lot of comments on here. I'd say, of the 100+ comments on this gap so far, there's a chunk that are, nits. Like this is a good example of a nit that, oh, we use this capitalization instead of that. I'd say that's a good chunk of them. But then there are some larger, broader themes that I think we should discuss today if we have time. And I may miss some, but well, let me jump down to the bottom. And again, if I've missed something important, please let me know. I know there's a lot of good stuff in here, but I tried to summarize some of the themes here. One of them that I think Toby mentioned here is kind of an interesting thing that others may have mentioned in passing in other comments, like, should we have a different resource for this? Is reusing HTTP route itself the right thing? If we're suggesting that this delegation would come with a small subset of features of the full HTTP route, is it better to represent that in a different way? I think we have at least 3 implementations represented on this call that have implemented delegation in some form, and it'd be interesting to hear the perspective there. But my understanding so far is that it's generally been represented as the same resource. Is that correct? Not saying that this is good or bad, but just in other implementations so far.
Yeah, it's been the same resource.
Same with console. It's the same resource.
And is it also the same kind of thing where you're providing a subset of functionality when you have delegation involved?
For Contour, I wouldn't say it's like, I mean, it effectively is a subset, but the subset is quite large, because you can still do most of the things you've done. It does mean that you end up having to define like what happens when the subset intersection is empty, or contradictory. You do have to define some stuff like that, but I mean that you're going to have to do that anyway. Like if you allow matching on path conditions for like inclusion and delegation, then you're going to have to handle like what happens if the path conditions are contradictory. You can only use path prefix because using a regex doesn't work, because how do you validate that the regexes are not greedy, or there's a bunch of other stuff like that, right? Like that stuff is going to be the same no matter what. I think like it probably does make sense a bit to split apart the nomenclature. I actually think that's a reasonably compelling argument. But yeah, I think that the argument is about like, hey, let's make it so that we have an object that's purpose fit to do exactly what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think one of the things we talked about previously as a challenge, and which kind of led me to proposing it using the same object type, was the challenge of keeping things in sync. So if you want to establish some initial routing parameters at that parent level, and say we made some type of additional filter option available, just picking something. If they're two different types of objects, then we have to be sure that we're always consistently adding things to both object types when it's appropriate, and make sure that the logic is always the same. It's a big opportunity for inconsistent behavior when you do that. So I looked at it as a safer approach, that kind of have one set of logic that does your validation, and you can't diverge between it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think this all leads, and that actually is a good segue into one of the themes that I saw throughout the comments, and that is a lot of confusion around what functionality delegation would support. And specifically, so yeah, a lot of the comments were some theme of, is this concept, is header modification, header matching supported on both levels? What happens when they conflict, as an example, like that. So some kind of comment like that. And I think that is kind of the biggest effort that's remaining with route delegation here, and something that we need to answer broadly, and maybe that can help decide if this should be the same resource or not, right? If we make that long list of, these are the 20 features of HTTP route, I don't know, whatever it is, and these are the 5 features that delegation supports. I don't know what the ratio will be there, but let's just imagine that's the case. Then maybe that helps guide us. Should this be the same resource, or is it just confusing to have a resource that is 75% not useful?
Yeah, I think so. Travis just asked a question in the chat about, like, is there is something about how do implementations handle this? I think the thing everyone needs to keep in mind here is that this actually doesn't have very much to do with the implementation. This is all about just taking stuff you can do in HTTP route already and like breaking it up in different ways to handle administrative stuff. This is 100% a gateway API. I think there's not much implementation specific stuff you actually need to worry about here. Like there will be stuff you'll need to do in the implementation, but I think Jeff, in retrospect, one of the errors we actually made here was, I think introducing the idea of the ephemeral route has been very confusing for people. Like I think people have not got what we were trying to say there. What the ephemeral route is intended to say is, practically when you are taking this system of things, at some point you're going to have to build a single model that you flush down to your config. That's all the ephemeral route idea is, right? Like that. Correct. You have to take all of these things, wash them against each other, and end up with a single config that you push to whatever is actually your data plane. That's it, right? Like that's all the ephemeral route is trying to say. It's not trying to say you need to create like this intermediate Kubernetes resource, or like, no. It's just trying to say, practically, you've got to build this thing out by being like, here's a listener. It's got a route attachment. That's got a route attachment. Or you collapse. Effectively, what you're doing is collapsing the config down into the listeners, which you got to do anyway when you're building out, when you're just attaching a route to a gateway.
Yeah.
Toby, I see your
I never say things in if I can say it in 10 words, or if I can say it in 100 at the same time. So I always choose the 100 words said. So
I have the same problem.
Yeah, you're very right, Nick. I mean, that's exactly what the concept of the ephemeral route is. It's just, it's just taking these pieces together and writing them out as one single route, which is really what it boils down to. So to me, it strikes me as fairly straightforward as far as like what's supported, because if you look at what the behavior should be, I'll take again the HTTP header example. If in the parent you were to add the header, and in the child you were to remove it, then that basically is that's a no op. You do nothing. So no decision gets made. There's no decision based off of it. So most things feel like that to me.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree that a lot of the decisions about what happens if it conflicts is just literally you just got to write down a set of rules for what happens if it conflicts, right? Like, if it produces a no-op, then you mark it as a warning. You mark it somehow that there's a no-op and you move on. If it produces conflicting information, like you you say make sure this isn't present, and then the other one says make sure it is. Then you're like, hey, I can't. This is irreconcilable. You can't have these two things happen at the same time. They're exclusive. And then if they're a subset, then you say, okay, that works. And I don't think those rules are actually that difficult to write down. But I think that, as I said, I think that the way that, and yeah, I mean, I read this whole thing before and it made perfect sense to me, Jeff. So I'm not like throwing stones at you. Like, I said it was fine before, but like reading back now after having people comment on the idea of the ephemeral route, it feels like we may have strayed too much towards making it sound like the ephemeral route was like an implementation requirement. Where it's like, it's not a requirement, it's a very useful way to think about it, right? Like in that, what would happen if this config was all in a single route is a very useful question to ask yourself to think about conflict resolution, but it's not an implementation requirement.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
That's
So,
exactly
Toby,
right.
Yeah, Toby, you unmuted, sorry.
Oh, thanks. So I guess where I had a problem with ephemeral route is not so much the specifics of it, but just that it needed to exist. So I think ephemeral route is basically, kind of trying to wallpaper over a hole in the wall here, which is that what happened here is that we basically forked HTTP route and said, okay, now there are two kinds of HTTP route. There's a parent HTTP route, which is signified by having, I think, rules about what can attach to it. And then there's a child HTTP route. And even though they're called the same thing, they behave very differently. And so, and I see ephemeral route is an attempt to kind of reconcile those two things, to say, well, you attach a route and it's a parent, but it's not really a route because it's a parent. And so at some point later, this other thing called an ephemeral route gets created, and it's the sum of a parent and a child, but then it's got its own soul in a sense. And so that's what led me to do the thought experiment of, if we just didn't call the thing an HTTP route and didn't make any expectation of route-ish behavior, then it becomes a template, or it becomes a scope, or it becomes a range or something. And then, at least conceptually, it becomes a lot easier for me to sort of think about, okay, when this happens, when you create an HTTP route template, you don't expect to get route behavior because it's a different thing.
So,
But then when you attach what we called a child, okay, now I've got a route, so I get route-ish behavior.
So I think, Nick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, you go.
So I think the challenge there is that, at least from, based off of the conversations we've had in the past and reflecting what I know from my customer base, is that what the use case is that we've been targeting is the fact where, as maybe a cluster administrator, I want to do some routing decisions, but then I want to allow a subset to be done by say the owners of a namespace. And so I'm only going to let certain traffic even get to them by defining those routing rules at the parent, and they can't override that and get traffic they shouldn't get. So in that regard, there's some, as a cluster admin, there are some other things I want to do with the traffic as it comes in. Maybe apply certain headers or something. So if the parent object isn't a route, then we go to the point where we start having to define these various behaviors that are route behaviors and make sure that we define them in the way that they're the same behavior with the same validation as in the HTTP route.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great point, because so maybe I don't understand the intent of the HTTP route, because my naive understanding from going through the spec once or twice is that that a parent HTTP route kind of has no reification. There's no route behavior until a child attaches to it. And so at that point, it sounds like what you're saying is that you've actually got two routes. So you have the picture that you're trying to show, which is at the point that a child attaches, now you've got two routes stacked on top of each other. A request would go through one of the routes and then down to the other route. So you're saying that at that point, the route becomes active and it can munge headers and munge paths and things like that.
I think you need to be really careful about the way that you're talking about this. The reason in Contour that we moved this to using the word include was we chose that word extremely carefully. The way you need to think about this is like hash includes in a C file, right? Or, you know, including a config file inside another one. That's what you're really doing here. You are including the child route inside the parent route with some sort of wrapper, right? Like that's what you're doing. And that's why we talked a lot about ephemeral routes, because practically when you are implementing this, in order to be able to make this work, you have to have like some sort of like realized version of all of these routes that, because you're effectively including the config from the child route into the parent one, you're like, at some point you're going to have to create like a pseudo route object. And in your implementation, you're going to have to create something that looks like a route that has like all of these things in the one spot. And then that, at that point, when you're doing that, is when you do the checking, like, hey, does this extension that's in the child one make sense? Like, you know, like, is there a contradictory set of conditions, or, you know, are there contradictory matches here, or are there filters that are incompatible with each other, or, you know, all of those sort of decisions as you're doing that. Like, at some point you've got to build a model of what the config looks like so that you can turn that config into config for your data plane. And that's all the ephemeral route idea is meant to be. It's not meant to be that you create an object in Kubernetes, or that it's literally just a logical construct to sort of summarize the idea of the fact that you're taking this thing and you're actually picking up the spec of the object and effectively including it in the parent object, just like a hash include in C, or, you know, like in one of many other config languages.
So, but based on the idea that the ephemeral route isn't created until the child is created, wouldn't it be the other direction, that you're including the parent route in the child route, and the child route is the reification of both of them?
I mean, sure, like it doesn't really matter which way around you think it. The important part here is that in order to be able to apply this, in order to be able to apply this config to a proxy at some point. So, but the thing is, it's not that the parent HTTP route does nothing, right? In the spec, you are explicitly allowed in. It's a bit confusing because of the words that we have to use, right? But you're explicitly allowed in that parent route, as you see here, you're allowed to match on things and have those go somewhere. What we saw in Contour was a lot of the time people did is you would use this for your main company website, right? So you'll have your default routing rule in your parent route for the main company website will be like a static service running somewhere, right? Like, you know, it's got your main company website, it's just a static thing, you know, it serves a lightning fast or something. And then you've got here, like /store and /API are sort of carved out, and requests to those are then forwarded off to some other service. And so like, that's the pattern that we've seen people actually wanting to do with this thing, is that you want to take a single URL space and sort of carve it up and give bits of it to other people. But in order to be able to do that, you need to have stuff like, you know, you need to be able to have routing happen at each of the layers. And that's one of the key things. Like, it's not, we're not building this in the abstract. Like, this is built, like, both Jeff and I have had built a thing like this before, that we have been addressing extremely specific use cases from people who are actually using it.
Right. So, but to take your example, which I think is a good one, you have a sort of top level of /store.
Yep.
Right. And that's enforced by the parent. And then the child route is ultimately /store/cart. And that's kind of another problem I have with this, is we're creating things that aren't explicitly created by users. But I guess the thought experiment is, what's the difference between stacking the two things on top of one another and just requiring that the child can only implement URLs that start with /store?
The idea here is to
Right.
make it, yeah. So just to answer that one, the idea here is to make it so that, I mean, to make it so that the child can only implement things that that allow, to do /store. Like, you're going to have a relationship with something that is controlled by the person who controls what is currently the parent route. But you're going to have a parent-child relationship there, because you need to be able to say what defines the thing that, the path that your thing sits behind.
Well, I disagree that you need a parent-child relationship. You need an object that specifies what the ranges are that the child is allowed to do. I mean, we have other examples of that with attachments. And so you could just say, if for example, the parent route were not a route, but it were a constraint object, it could say, reject any attempt to attach if the URL doesn't begin with /store.
Yeah, and I think that is along the lines of what you had proposed, of a different object that acted as in place of the parent route here, right? Something like I think you called it the template, but some resource, and I think we've just been calling that like a parent concept, but whatever that resource is, it sits between a gateway and what is defined here as a child route, and it says things in this namespace can only attach to this path or this prefix path. Is that kind of what you're describing here?
Right. So, I mean, I think we're sort of talking about two approaches of the same thing, and I think they're roughly comparable. I mean, one is basically to say that what we're calling a child route here is basically just a route, but we can constrain what it's allowed to look like. We can constrain what it's allowed, what URLs it's allowed to do, whether it's allowed to do certain things or not. There are basically, you could imagine a sort of RBAC type system that says, oh, you've tried to do something that, you've tried to move outside of a URL scope that we define for you, so we're not going to let you attach. And that doesn't require a parent-child relationship. It just requires a sort of rule relationship, rule-based control relationship that says these things are allowed to do these and these other things are allowed to do something else. And that way you don't get the sort of, oh, well, I have to figure out whether this is a parent route by context and then build a mental model of what it's supposed to do at what points.
So I guess, so it seems to me like what you're proposing is that you have some resource that has like /store/API and any other constraints that you want to put on it, and says, for this domain name, you can only do these things for these domain name. And if you want to hit /store, like, you need to have a constraint or something. But how do you associate that constraint with the routes? Do you just not, and you're just expecting the thing to look at the constraints and look at the routes and book them up somehow? Like, how do you know what constraints apply to what routes?
Well, because you would only allow access to the gateway via a specific set of constraints.
So what you're saying is the gateway would be bound, the constraints would be attached to the gateway, and then, but how, yeah, I get that. But like, then what do the routes attach to?
The routes attach to the gateway in a way that doesn't violate the constraints. Like, the route could reference a set of constraints, or it could not. But we could basically say the gateway has this set of constraints, and if you want to attach a route to this gateway, it has to meet all of the constraints that were specified for it.
I think in the context of how Gateway API works today, that just the resource model itself, you need that hierarchy, right? Of the child route, the route at the very bottom of this tree would need to be able to attach to
Something.
that delegation thing that allows that to happen. And then that delegation thing, whatever we call it, would need to be able to attach to the gateway. So right now that's called a parent route. And in this proposal, but I think what you're describing is still something that fits at that level in the hierarchy. It may just be a different resource, but I think it still needs that connection, that, you know, both the reference up to gateway and the reference down to the child HTTP route. I think those are still required in that model, right?
It's possible. I haven't worked through the entire thing. I was just looking at it over the weekend, but what my concern, you know, is that I would prefer that route be one thing with one set of behaviors, instead of
I can kind of
here,
yeah.
what's that one there?
I think that's a reasonable objection, but I think that the reasons that we've chosen to do things this way are to sort of meet specific problems and meet specific use cases, right? And that's like you sort of made a side comment before about how you don't like that there's an implied prefix when you import a route into, like, when the child attaches to the parent. That is literally that is the solution to a problem that we had in Contour with ingress route. So ingress route was our earlier attempt at doing something like this, where you could delegate things. And what happened there was that we didn't have that. You could have any prefix you liked in the parent routes and in the child routes. But if they didn't match up, then it just didn't work. And that was worse because it meant that the owner of the eventual thing needed to know all of the possible places where it could be put. One of the advantages of doing things in the way that we're doing here is that the child HTTP routes are composable. You can put them into multiple parents and it'll still work. As long as, I mean, practically you do have to do some rewrite, but the tools are there for you to do the rewrite in both locations. And that's I guess what it comes down to is the Gateway API is built as a hierarchy as it stands. Gateways have gateway classes have routes. And so the reason that this made sense to me is that this extends the hierarchy by one level. I understand what you're saying, that it's slightly confusing to have things be named the same thing that have different behaviors. But like, because they have extremely similar behaviors in many ways, you know, like a large slab of the behavior that you need to have available in the parent route, i.e. the routing functionality, means that if you make this a template, then to meet the rules, the requirements where you want to be able to have like a default routing thing that's owned by the cluster admin, what will happen then is that cluster admin will need to own like a template and then a route, right? Like, you know, and that template and then that route will need to be attached to the template. And then the template will also need to be attached. We'll also need to have space for other things to attach to it. Like, so you can do it. We can do it that way, but you're going to end up with like a bit of extra boilerplate for the person who owns the template or the whatever you want.
I guess, I mean, your example, I think, is good in the sense that we have a gateway that attaches, you know, and then there are a variety of different things that attach to the gateway. I don't think there's any place in the spec where a thing attaches to a thing of its own kind, except for this. And so I would argue that the template approach honors the current design far more than saying we have this sort of kind of recursive but limited, you know, artificially limited, you know, limited that it can only be either a parent or a child and not both, and a route can't attach to another route more than 2 levels deep. I mean, this to me adds a new behavior that the spec up until now does not have. I mean, yeah, we got a hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy of different things connecting to the different things that they're allowed to connect to. And we're inserting this sort of almost circular turtles all the way down thing, but except that we have a rule that says that you can't have turtles all the way down. You can only have one turtle standing on another turtle, and then you're done. So I'd rather have an explicit different object and wedge that in between the gateway and the route in some optional cases.
This is great conversation. I do want to wrap it up in the next 5 minutes or so because we have other items to get to. I do want to, there are a few people that have unmuted during this time and haven't gotten a chance to speak yet. I think, Micaiah, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I had some thoughts, if it's still relevant. So when I look at the API from a user perspective, I'm thinking I have a route that's logically using another route as the back end. I'm thinking logically this route is forwarding to that route. And I realize that's not the way it really works. But then the same is true if you have a route with a service as the back end. It's not really going through the service proxy. And to Tony's point, the same way you can have a route that you configure, this is a parent route, or you're thinking of it as a parent route, and the configuration is incomplete until you have the child route attached to it. The same is true if you have an HTTP route and you specify a service and say the service doesn't have any endpoints, your configuration is incomplete. So I don't think there's a big discrepancy there. But I mean, the bottom line is the API is for users. And as a user, logically, I'm thinking this route, my example route is sending traffic. You know, if it matches this criterion, it goes to the store route, or if it's that criterion, it goes to the core services route, which then has a service backend. So I'm just thinking logically, you know, the API is designed for users foremost. So you know, that's the way I think about route delegation and having a route with a route as a backend. Maybe Nick or Rob or others can tell me why that mental model is wrong. Does that make sense? Or kind of, to me, the template kind of just complicates things from that viewpoint.
Yes, I agree with that statement. I think some way I'd kind of summarize some of this is that we start with the use case. What is it that we're trying to address? And so what capabilities do we need at each entity, if you will, involved in that use case, right? So the basics is we've got basically a cluster administrators, or a global administrator, whatever you want to call them, and namespace administrators. And the cluster admins want to be able to control some things that when it comes to routing traffic, that the and restrict what the namespace admins can do. And so if you look at it that way, then what the cluster admin may want to do the exact same things at the cluster level that they might want to do if you didn't have child routes. So I may want to insert headers. I may want to do mirroring and such. And I simply don't want to allow the namespace admins to control some of that. So that's where we get this parent-child relationship, and it really is about more than anything, it's about the delegation of authority and who controls what. What I've seen in my experience, and Nick's talked about his, what I've seen is having a config model where there are two different objects, like a template at the parent level, and you keep adding functionality to that parent, and it's like, like the route lets me do this, but the route template doesn't, and I really want that. So we add that to the template, and we keep doing that, and pretty soon these two things look very, very similar, but they're not quite the same, and so they each have just a little bit different logic, and the validation code it's just a little bit different, and it gets out of sync. It's like a recipe for chaos in some ways, and for a user, it's very confusing to say, okay, if I'm defining a filter, or a match criteria, I do it this way if I'm doing it at the template, and I do it this way if I'm doing it down at the route.
But don't you get the same issue if you have two different resources that eventually converge very similarly in behavior? I guess it's like you'll have that problem anyways, because you have a delegated route necessarily is a subset of the functionality of the whole, right? The question is, it's almost like you can discuss it sort of like, just like, what is the trade-off here in terms of design? Are you going to end up with a different resource that essentially, after iterating it a couple times and adding features, reaches feature parity with the parent almost in terms of, you know, the shape and then kind of like what the spec looks like? Or do you start off with saying, well, it's going to get there anyways, and the most useful thing is to just restrict kind of what can go there? It's a tough call, I would say. One thing that the API is fairly neutral in terms of what it supports. So it's hard to see that if you copied the resource into a new one, that you would end up significantly different than just the resource we already have. But that's just, I think, the group's current take on it. People can correct me if I'm misrepresenting.
Yeah, you know, I think this is a good transition here to the last comments on here, or themes of the last comments. And as I was kind of describing earlier in the meeting, it seems like a big theme throughout these comments is questions about what delegation would support, what's the scope, what features, how does it work, you know? And I think having some kind of table laid out, maybe it starts as a doc. I don't know where it belongs, but it's a huge effort on its own to outline every single feature of HTTP route and how it interacts with this, right? But I feel like that's what we need. And I remember, you know, the feature request that I saw in OSS that really, well, I shouldn't say it started this discussion, but it is a good part of it, was I want to delegate path/foo to foo namespace. And that's what the feature we see all throughout our gap or whatever. And if that's really all it is, if it's really just path prefix to HTTP route, then the full HTTP route resource is potentially overkill. It seems like it's more than that, but outlining exactly what it is, it feels very important. And I think you've already covered a chunk of that, and so correct me if there's already some in here, but that feels like just the theme of the comments that seem most significant to me in the gap as it exists today. And so Jeff, I know you've got a ton going on, so let us know if we can help you with any part of this. I know that like this is a massive gap, and there are parts that we could potentially, you know, break out if it helps. But yeah, let us know how it can help.
Something you suggested, Rob, to me in our direct conversations was, you know, maybe some of the status stuff we extract into a sub, maybe like an appendix or something, so we can work on that kind of independently. And I think the idea of having a table or you know, how things, you know, what's supported at the parent versus the child, and how when you merge them, you know, what's the behavior under certain situations. I think that sounds like an appendix to me as well, that I think, you know, multiple people could contribute to. So I need to go through, you know, the comments myself. I need to respond to some that I can address directly, but those are my first couple of suggestions, is that, you know, we kind of treat those things as appendices to the gap that can be updated semi-independently.
So Jeff, I mean, one concern I had while I was reading it that just made it a little bit difficult was having to wade through all the comments about fairly trivial things. I would actually volunteer if you want. I can go through the comments and make my own fork of your spec and apply what I would consider to be trivial, non-controversial, I'm making air quotes here, changes, i.e. not the delegation stuff, but I mean, especially in terminology, markdown formatting, all that kind of bullshit. I mean, if you want, I would do that and push another revision. And at least that way we're starting with a clean copy.
I mean, you're certainly welcome to do that. I think, you know, a lot of the, sometimes a lot of the details were, I was trying to think of different scenarios that I kind of see, I've seen that I've encountered, and trying to address, you know, what would be that case. If the comments aren't helpful, then sure, we can make we can extract those if that people feel that would make it easier. I'm not sure.
I think he's just referring to you know, the various formatting and typos and things like that. That there's a bunch of those that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just last weekend I sat down to walk through the spec and all 100 some odd comments on it, and a lot of them were just chaff because the spec hasn't been updated since it was originally proposed, and so I would, you know, be happy to just go through and that would clean out the pull request because we could resolve a whole bunch of comments. So then Toby 2.0, who's coming into the process next week, doesn't have to walk through 100 comments, most of which are like trivially resolved. Because I mean, I think that's it. One of the problems with this spec, quite frankly, is it is really big.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of, and so, you know, so you, for example, you and Nick raised some very valid use cases that are not in the spec. So I'm coming in and saying, I'm trying to evaluate it based on the use cases that are in the spec. And then we start discussing them. And it turns out there are a whole bunch of other use cases that I don't know about. So
I think in terms of like GitHub workflow, isn't it the case that you can send a patch to Jeff? And I mean, I'm hesitant to like clone a PR because, right, like we still want to preserve the history. So my advice is, you know, it's Git, right? Like you can have a patch where you have merged all the markdown changes and then just send it to Jeff, and then Jeff can just apply it on his PR.
Yeah,
Like that seems like the easiest thing to do.
that was just what I was going to suggest, and I would welcome that, Toby.
Yeah,
and then
that's
you know,
what
then
that's what I did with the original status. We did with the status stuff in there. Like, so I actually did that
and
status stuff. So yeah, I
then
would
the next,
encourage you to do that.
then we'd want to go through and you know, close a lot of the comments so the next guy that's trying to read it will, you know, have an easier time.
Yeah, and I, you know, I'd be happy to do that as you know, with based off of the revisions you make to, you know, clean up all the noise.
All right, I'll get my bucket and my shovel and get to work.
Thank you. I appreciate the offer of help with that, Toby. I really do.
Okay, so this is great. I think we're splitting this out well. So Toby, thanks for volunteering for that. I think the other thing, split out the status bit into a sub gap. Maybe Nick, since you've already been doing a lot of the status stuff, if you can formalize that. And then I think I can handle the last one, which is at least create the workflow for creating the feature list, some ideas for what may or may not be in scope and how that could work. And I'm sure that will have lots of comments on its own, but maybe that lives in a different PR. That seems good. We have lots more to get to here, so I'm going to keep on going here. Let's move right into Nick's new gap, which is backend properties. This is just a high level gap at this point, right?
Yeah, so Shane had a great suggestion here to try and avoid ending up having to go as deep, sort of explaining everything to everybody as we've had to with inclusion, is to sort of rather than move straight to like, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it, that we try out saying like, let's all agree on what we're going to do and what problems we're solving and why we're solving those problems. Put the gap in as provisional in that way, and then come back around and actually have like, I mean, I've got plenty of ideas of how I would do it, but let's agree on the what and the why first, so that then we're not like, then when we're doing the how, we're not spending time like talking about the what and the why, right? So I think this feels like a thing that will probably be good for big gaps in the future, is to sort of be like, let's agree on the what and the why of what we're doing, and then we'll come back to the how. And so, yeah, sorry, Jeff.
I was just gonna say, I just want to point out that that is what we did with the route inclusion stuff too. Start off as a Google Doc. And
Yeah, I know,
let people, okay,
I think that I'm not throwing stones at us, man. Like
I know you're not.
I'm up to my neck in the route delegation thing as well, right? Like what I'm trying to say is I think that there's an improvement we can make here where we merge a simpler gap that's a provisional gap that has the sort of the what and the why, just the what and the why, right? So that the diff that you're looking at then is not like here's like 1,000 lines of stuff. It's like here's what we have agreed already, and now here's how we're going to do it, right? And so I think it was great. Shane asked, can we avoid Google Docs? What we have found in the past is that, you know how we were just saying about how reviewing a thing with like 100 comments on it in GitHub kind of sucks. Like, think about that if we had 500 to 700 comments on it, which is what we will often get in the very early phases of doing a GDoc, is that there'll be a lot of iteration very quickly. And so like, that's why we in the past we've used GDocs for the initial thing, is that it lets you sort of go backwards and forwards a bit quicker and sort of, you know, and when you resolve the comments in Google Docs, they disappear, like, and you can't see them anymore. And so like,
that's the key, isn't it? People
Yeah,
just want the resolved comments to disappear.
yeah, absolutely, right. And so like I mean, I think the thing that GitHub has where the resolved comments sort of stay and say this comment was resolved is useful in some ways, but in the very early phases, like being able to make it so you have like a clean thing to review, as Toby was saying, is actually really, really useful as well. And so I think that's why we've tended to err on the side of doing a GDoc first, because it lets you sort of keep a clean setup in that initial GDoc. And then when you pick up that GDoc and put it in, it's like, okay, now we do a pass on what we've got written here and see if it makes sense to people who haven't been keeping up with the GDoc. Does that make sense, Shane?
Yeah, but dude, I can't review a GDoc in command line.
Oh yeah, you can download it.
Ew.
Yeah. So right now, this this actual issue, if you could just scroll down a bit, there's been a little bit of conversation on here already. I've put the thing in there. I think that John made a good point that and Mike, I think that one of the things we want to do here is be very clear that some of the stuff we're doing is going to be useful in the mesh/gamma use cases. But I think that keeping the mesh encryption separate is a good idea. Like the main thing that we're talking about here is how you get from the gateway to the back end, right? Like and the encryption hop there. I think that Evan referenced in that 91 issue that's there where it says just below Rob. Evan mentioned this issue 4 days ago. Yeah, so that one is that this issue describes client certificate validation on the outside of listeners. I put a thing down the bottom to sort of clarify that. But so this issue describes client certificate validation, like for clients who live out in the internet or outside the cluster or external to the gateway. And like right now, we don't have a spot in the API to put the client certificate validation details for if you want to have client certificates there. There's a little bit of complexity there. That's not just like, hey, drop some config in, because most people who do that want to use the client cert for authentication, and probably then details from the client cert for authorization. So you've got to make sure that a few things happen. That's what some of the discussion in that one is from. But yeah, I just wanted to make clear that 1282 is all about gateway to backend, like gateway to backend. That's why I called it backend properties, because that's what it is. I am trying to avoid the use of the terms upstream and downstream, because Envoy flips those around to what a lot of people who are used to using reverse proxies talk about. Upstreams in Envoy talk are backends, not clients. And so I'm being very specific in using backend and client, because those are more clear terms and aren't subject to confusion. So Rob, if you could pull up the GDoc. There's been a bit of conversation on there already. I would encourage people to have a look. I don't think this one is like that tricky to get the what we're trying to do here. I did expand that one that Shane the comment there. I think that most of the comments are kind of resolved. I think John has a thing he is again saying the same stuff that he did on the thing that, that we need to be clear about what the information is, but I think that this is actually feels to me like it should be reasonably close to something reviewable for like the what and the why. I think the prior art section here that used the thing that the issue that Candace logged about the specific case of TLS details only was really useful. Thank you, Candace, for that. But yeah, I think this is slightly more general than that discussion. So yeah, please have a look at this. I think I've resolved most of the comments. I kind of would like people to read it before I go changing it too much more, to sort of make sure that it's clear. That's the GDoc link there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Glad that's already linked. I have not had a chance to look at it, but I will this week. Should that be our goal then, just to make sure everyone who wants to has reviewed the doc this week and transition? Okay.
Yeah, I think
Cool.
so. I think so.
Great. All right. Got to keep moving pretty quickly here. Translation tools. This is you as well, Nick.
Yeah. So I just wanted to put this in here to mention on the record that I have discussed a couple of times. I don't have anything tracking this. That at some point we should look. We as a community should ensure that there are some tools to help people get from one thing to another, to get from ingress to gateway. As current contour maintainer, I would want like HTTP proxy to gateway. I would imagine that a lot of the other folks who have their own CRDs would probably want something to help translate from other CRDs to gateway. So it feels like something that might be useful is like a tool that has a little bit of a plugin style framework that lets you suck in config from somewhere and then spit it out as gateway. Would be generally useful for the community. I think Sanjay from the Contour team is going to get started on something for Contour, so that we'll have something to sort of look at. But then I just wanted to raise this, that it's something that's on my radar, that I think that it'll be a really useful UX thing to be able to help people move. Like, oh, you want to try out the Gateway API? Well, here's a thing that will take your ingress and put it in there. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Keith. Yeah, the SMI controller SDK might be another good place to start. But I think one of the things that I would like us all to have think about is, if we did build something like that, where should it live? Should it live in the Gateway API repo? Should it be like a specific thing that starts out somewhere else and comes into the Gateway API repo when it's more built? Like, I don't know. I have no idea. But I just wanted to phrase that. If we had a tool like this that was like a community supported one, would it make sense to put it in the Gateway API repo or some other repo that the Gateway API project controls? Or I don't know. Like, have a think about that and think about what we might do there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure offhand. I know that I thought I'd seen someone talking about doing the ingress to gateway conversion already, but I don't know what the progress of that is. Yeah, that'd be very valuable. I don't have a strong opinion on where it should live. I just want it to exist.
I think if it's ingress to gateway, that's like a Kubernetes standard resource to standard resource. That definitely seems like it fits well. Yeah. I think like if you try to suck in lots of non-standard projects, you do run into the cloud provider problem in standard Kubernetes, which is like eventually just gets so big and hard to maintain that it gets difficult.
Yeah, I guess my thought there was that you'd have like that you could make it so that either the generation of the gateway bit was reusable, or you just had one thing that had like plug-in-y stuff on the left hand on the input side.
Yeah, I mean it sounds interesting, and if someone is willing to whip up what the general shape of it is, then we should definitely discuss it.
Yeah, I think this is more of a placeholder. Let's leave it for now.
Cool. Next on the agenda, I wrote out this was mostly for my own. Oh, no, not next on the agenda. I missed one. This is not publicly visible yet. I need to work with one of the GitHub admins in Kubernetes org to make it so, but I just sketched out a project board for gap tracking. This is something that had been suggested at various points. Very much a work in progress, but I thought it was useful to see the things that have merged, where they are for conformance, for example, You can see some of these that have made it to experimental, don't have conformance. There's one that has made it to standard that doesn't have conformance tests yet. These kinds of things, this is very much something that evolves, but if you have ideas for project boards, let me know. Want this to be a little bit more, well, let any of the maintainers know. Just want this to be a little bit more discoverable if you're trying to understand where the project is headed and the major themes.
I think that's
With-
great.
Cool.
I definitely let's do that.
Cool. Next, the 060 rough timeline here. I just wanted to get something out at a rough level of, if we want to have a release out by KubeCon, let's walk backwards and think about, when do we need to hit these dates by? And from my perspective, you know, if we consider these rough dates reasonable, it means early September, we need to have our gaps merged and implemented that we want to get in 060. And if they're not in by September 12, I think we need to start going through the process of backing them out. So that's, you know, in some sense, it may seem like a long ways out, but it's not. Yeah, there's a lot to do. I think at a minimum, we should be able to get reference grant and gRPC route in a release before KubeCon, hopefully something else. But we are just about out of time for today's meeting, so I don't want to go too far into that. Just keep these dates in your mind when you're thinking about projects and things you might want to get into the next gateway release. And finally, with not any minutes to spare, I want to just highlight gRPC route. Pre-submits are passing. I think everyone has had a chance to look at this. All the comments are resolved. I think personally, I think this is ready to merge. I wanted to highlight it here to give anyone one last chance to object. Otherwise, I think I or one other maintainer will formally approve this and get it in. Any last objections before we go ahead with this? Cool. Okay. Again, reach out in the next 24 hours or so. Otherwise, we'll aim on just getting this in. With that said, thanks everyone for a great discussion, and we'll talk to you. Actually, for anyone in Gamma, meeting is morning Pacific time, so around what, 18 hours from now, 16 hours from now. Keith, you know, you may know, but anyways, it's earlier than normal. So we'll see everyone there or next week. Have a great one.